All right, so welcome everyone. Slideshow beginning. All right, and welcome to the Brains Behind the Beauty, the hidden depths of old Hollywood starlets. So, the reason I've wanted to do this program for a while, and it kind of dovetails into something I've talked about in a couple of programs. I talked about it in the Ruby and Ossie Davis program. I've talked about it in Hollywood and the Red Scare. I talked about it during the Hollywood Strikes program. Is kind of the idea of actors are, despite what we may think, and I know there's that the stars, they're just like us. That's kind of thrown around and used sarcastically, but yes, actors are very real people. And again, I will also tell people most actors don't make Brad Pitt money. Even some of the women featured in this, had their financial hardships. If anything, in Hollywood, it's a I think regardless of what era we're in, it's always a little harder to keep yourself employed in Hollywood because this is an industry that's obsessed with youth and beauty, and they're, you know, male stars are for the most part allowed to age, are allowed to become like distinguished old actors versus women do not tend to get the same opportunities. Kirsten Dunst, who has been acting since the early 1990s, started out as a child performer and transitioned into acting as an adult. She gave an interview recently where people asked, like, oh, well, we haven't seen you in too many films, but she has a new movie coming up, Civil War, in which she plays a reporter. And she said, well, I'm pretty much the only roles I'm getting offered now are mom roles. And Kirsten Dunst, I think, is about 40 years old. She's roughly my age, maybe a little bit older. But she is, again, she's almost 40 or she is a little over 40. She has children now, and Hollywood just sees her as, well, you're just mom now. And this happens to a lot of very talented actresses. It's like you hit 30 and all of a sudden you're mom. Um, that happened to Mila Kunis, that happened to Kirsten Bell, and even more well-known actresses like Julianne Moore. She said one of the reasons she took some kind of a cruddier movies in the early aughts was she was going through a divorce, so she needed to pay. But she was also like, I figured I was getting older and I didn't know if I'd get cast anymore. So I figured make the money now so I have something to hang on to. Um, but beyond that, there's also the stereotype that not just women, but all Hollywood stars tend to be vain, they're vapid, they're airheads, they have no thoughts going on in their brains whatsoever. And again, I'll say, you can meet people on the street who work in any kind of occupation who are incredibly thoughtful and smart and well versed on the issues. And you can meet the same people in every profession who have, I don't know, next to nothing going on upstairs as well. A person's profession does not really determine any type of their intellectual capacity. So, um, and then the third part, I promise I have a point, is we have this idea of old Hollywood starlets kind of just being, again, these beautiful women, but we also have this idea of old Hollywood was a very wholesome place, where, women were, like when girls were girls and men were men. But I also wanted to highlight these women because these were women, and more so than just the women featured here, who had to scrape and hustle and pivot to keep their careers going. And if you think the, obsession with youth is bad now, or if you thought like the casting couch stuff was bad now, think of how much worse it had to be back then. So I wanted to start with Hedy Lamarr, who is probably like the quintessential example of a beautiful woman who, at her time, was known for her beauty, but turned out to be an incredibly smart person who actually ended up, in this case, creating something that led to technology we use every day. So Hedy Lamarr was initially not from the United States. She was from Vienna, right there. She was married at 18 and she had her first film. Her first film was called Ecstasy, and that was released in 1933. And it was a very controversial film. And if you would like to maybe understand why, look at the date Hedy Lamarr was born and then go, okay, if this movie was released in 1933, this had to be filmed in 1932. Oh, yeah. Controversial, although for its time, not controversial for that. It was more controversial because it simulated intercourse fairly graphically and pleasure. And, you know, I wish I could say that was controversial for its time, but there's still people who watched Poor Things and got really upset by some of it. So, um, but she was someone who got kind of I would imagine somewhat taken advantage of at 18. She married her first husband, Fritz Mandel, much older than she was, by the way. He had seen her in her first film and was like, oh, I like her. And it was not a good marriage. He was abusive and he was very controlling, financially controlling, verbally abusive, physically abusive. So afterwards she realizes like I need to get out of here and re realizes she's like, well, I can't just walk out, or can I? So what she does was she impersonates a housemaid, grabs those clothes, and she just leaves with the staff at the end of the day. But keep in mind, she didn't get to leave with much. She basically is just like, all right, I'm out of this bad relationship, and she basically had to kind of, hustle her way along. Luckily, the film Ecstasy had been seen by others in America, and Louis B. Mayer did invite her to Hollywood. And she eventually made her debut in 1938 and became one of, like, considered one of the most beautiful women in the golden age of Hollywood. Um, but we now know that her beauty was not the only asset that she had. And she actually created something that led to things we all use today. So she was a bright student, but back then, a pretty girl, they were kind of told, like, oh no, go be a dancer, go be a model, or go get married and have children. The idea of women in sciences was still kind of a little, not, there wasn't the push for girls in STEM back then the way there is now. Let's just leave it at that. But she really liked to tinker. She liked to invent. So she was friends with the composer George and Thiel. I hope I'm saying that correctly. They developed something called frequency hopping, which is a radio communication system. And now radio communication system, like, that sounds like something we use a lot. And they actually went to the United States government and said, like, hey, do you want this? Because this was also during World War II. Hedy wanted to do something to actually help the war effort, um and help, clearly help the United States government, despite, where she came from, she was on our side. um but the US government was like, no, we're fine, we don't need it, and they did have a patent at the time. However, by the time that this technology was kind of looked over and said, hey, there's something to this, their patent had expired. So her estate and George and Thiel's estate never really saw any of, like, the residuals from what they created. But frequency hopping inspired Wi-Fi, GPS, stuff we use every day. And thankfully, the fact that there is a track record of, like, patents, Hedy Lamarr is able to get the credit not only for this invention, but for being more than a pretty face. So moving on to the silent era, and if actually anyone, or raise your hands or put something into the chat, how familiar are you with the silent era? So when we think of women in the silent era, do we think of very assertive women? Answer, probably not. We think a lot of fainting girls, screaming women, Great acting for what you can do with silent stuff. You can go over the top. You can be a little more dramatic. Um, but a lot of the women who worked in there were pretty sharp, and Mary Pickford is a good example. So she was arguably America's first sweetheart. She was the girl with the curls. She was hired by D.W. Griffith at age 17. Again, this is also something I'm gonna let you know right now. A lot of women getting their start when they're really not women, and being kind of scouted out by men a lot older than them. Although I don't, in some cases it doesn't look like there was anything inappropriate, but in a 2024 world, it is a little weird. But she was a huge, huge, huge star. And at one point she was earning 350,000 each for three films in 1917. And also that's $350,000 in 1917. So adjust that for inflation. So she was a huge star. She was a big pull. But she also realized, hey, wait a minute, I should get better pay. People are coming to see me. I'm the name. So, arguing for better pay, she actually got her own production within the famous players company. Adolf Zukor gave her that because he wanted to keep her. He knew what an asset she was. So she had Mary Pickford Studios, and she started to actually, choose what projects got made, and choose her own projects a little bit, but still 2 years late, in 1919, she strikes out with D.W. Griffin, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, who was her husband at one point, and they form a studio. And the studio was United Artists. And about 60 years later, Michael Cimino nearly burned that studio to the ground with Heaven's Gate, but thankfully, United Artists still kind of lives. Um, Now, unfortunately, Mary Pickford did not really transition to the talkie period as well as another silent actress we will discuss. And she actually had a fairly tumultuous relationship with Douglas Fairbanks, and she also had her own issues with alcohol. So she became a recluse later in life, sadly. However, she is, for a lot of younger actresses, whether they know it or not, the trail for asking, to be paid for what you're worth was blazed by Mary Pickford. So this is someone I think we all know as being a like, oh, she's tough behind the scenes, and that's Lucille Ball. A woman who was extremely funny and extremely savvy. But here's the thing, nowadays we have social media. We have, I mean, there were the trades, but it was also not as acceptable for, women to be as assertive back in that day. So we know about, actresses like Margot Robbie sort of going like negotiating her own pay, or Emma Stone, who produces some films that she likes. We understand that these actresses aren't just dolls that get painted up and shoved in front of a camera. They are active participants in their profession. But back in the 50s, that wasn't entirely known to us unless you read the pages of Variety and were really into Hollywood gossip. And Lucille Ball, this is somewhere where you look at where her story started out, you're like, ooh, yeah, this could end horribly. Because again, look at that. Dropped out at 15 to study acting. And again, acting, any kind of performing arts, already a risky career. There are hundreds of people who try to make it each year, and maybe 10 really make it. And then there's a good amount who are able to be working actors, but the breakout stars are few and far in between. So she started her work in theater, and then she was able to get an advertisement, being a poster girl for cigarettes. Again, something else that really isn't a viable career choice now. But by the end of the 1930s, she'd been in over 40 films, but she hadn't had a starring role, and she didn't really quite fit the mold of what Hollywood wanted. Like, she was a beautiful woman. If you ever look at photos of her when she's young, she's stunning. But her sensibility and, just wasn't quite what the studios were looking for. And again, she knew she had comedic talent. So she meets Desi, I hope I'm saying his name right, Arnaz. I always heard it pronounced Arnaz. And they create Desilu Studios and the sitcom I Love Lucy, which is a smash hit. I don't think ever left the top five, however long it was on. And they created Desilu so she could maintain control over the show. And actually, as I put here, when she and Desi divorced, she kept control of the studio, which for the time, almost unheard of. And if and did anyone see the film Being the Ricardos? It came about out about 2 or 3 years ago. Um, Not a fan of it, nothing personal. I'm just personally not an Aaron Sorkin fan. But one of the things that film got right was however goofy Lucy was in front of the camera, when that camera stopped rolling, she was all business. She was looking over scripts. She was looking at the film and at the dailies and scrutinizing her performance and the performances of others. She wanted to put out a good project. You could say I Love Lucy was her baby. And speaking of which, Lucille Ball is a trailblazer in another way because when she was pregnant, she wanted Lucy to be pregnant. And nowadays, that is not unheard of. If an actress is pregnant, sometimes it is written into the show completely. They just say like, oh, what was it? I think How I Met Your Mother. There's a character where she's married to someone else and she's expecting, and they just said, well, we'll write that into the show. Or they just say we'll work around it. But back in the day, that was a taboo. This was still the time when couples were being shown as sleeping in separate beds on television. So for her to be like, oh no, I'm going to be depicted as pregnant. I'm going to be heavily pregnant on screen. You're not going to hide this away or write me out. Incredibly bold move, and one that I don't think every actress could have pushed for back then. We got that, and a really great episode. Lucy is Enciente, I think I'm saying that correct, where she surprises Ricky by having him sing a song. We're having a baby. Um, but yeah, it was incredibly groundbreaking for its time. And also, I have to say, as a person who does like science fiction, she helped give the world Star Trek. So Desilu Studios was one that looked at Star Trek, and although people I read on a Star Trek site, someone was like, Lucille Ball didn't exactly get what Star Trek was really supposed to be. But she did say, like, this sounds like a cowboy show in space. This sounds neat. And she liked the general message of, like, a forward-thinking society and togetherness. And she's like, I'll give it a shot. But when the network was really like, maybe we should cancel the show, she was the one going, no, I think this show has potential. I think the show has legs. So we now have one of our longest running science fiction franchises because of Lucille Ball. So nerds, be sure to thank her. Anna May Wong. Also, before we get started, I would like to say a very good book about her came out last year called Daughter of the Dragon. Read it, would highly recommend reading it as well. And she's a person who came from very humble beginnings, certainly not someone we would include in the Nepo baby discussion. Her parents were immigrants and laundry owners in Los Angeles. And she was not exactly told, like, this is who you could be. You could be an actress. She had to, skip school to go audition or tell her parents, like, I'm staying after school to, go see if she could be an extra. And at 15, she lands an extra role in the film The Red Lantern. So this is showing a drive that she has to pursue this career. And she gets her first leading role at 17 in the film The Toll of the Sea, which unfortunately some of her films are lost to time, but some Toll of the Sea, I believe, is still available. And again, if you look at this photo, she was a beautiful woman, but she was unfortunately put into the Dragon Lady archetype, which is, or was, and still is, a fairly offensive caricature of Asian women. They're usually deceitful, they're sexy, but it's sexy in a dangerous way. They're usually propped up as an opposition to, a virginal white woman. And, she wanted to act, but sadly in Hollywood, these were the only roles she could really get. And there was another layer to this because she could not be a romantic lead. So she could not have a dashing white man as her partner because of anti-miscegenation laws. So she had the Dragon Lady role, and eventually she went to Europe and she did find some better roles there. Unfortunately, that was stopped in the 1930s with the rise of World War II and the rise of the Nazi Party. And she started to see the very same laws and rhetoric that drove her out of the United States industry starting to rise up in Germany. So she decided to get out of there, rightfully so. She did try to start her own production company, following in the footsteps of people like Mary Pickford. Unfortunately, that company folded because her business corrupt partner was not the most above board. There have been some reports saying it was just honest miscalculation. There have been others that said it was corruption, and Anna May Wong believed more that the business partner was just not reputable. So that's why I went with corruption. So in the 1930s, after she left Germany, there were a lot of performers who left the United States, went to Germany in like the late 20s, early 30s. Josephine Baker was another one who saw what was happening and got out very quickly, or in Josephine Baker's case, actually tried to be a part of the resistance. And actually, there were creators in Germany, Fritz Lang being a very well-known one, who saw in the very early 30s how bad it was getting and got out as quickly as they could. But she decided to go to China to get in touch with her roots. And once again, World War II um, interrupted that because she started to see the effects of the Japanese invasion of Korea and then China firsthand. So when she came back to the United States, she actually utilized her celebrity to advocate for the plight of Chinese citizens in World War II. Um, and utilizing her star power for that actually brought a lot of awareness to it at a time where, I mean, again, United States has a history of being fairly hostile to Chinese immigrants. And in the 1930s, the feeling towards both Germany and what was happening in China were cautious, but China was almost ambivalent. It was a feeling of ambivalence. So she used what she could to try to tell people what was happening in the world. And sadly, she died fairly young in her 60s, but she was able to still kind of parlay her career as she got older. She went into television. She hosted an anthology show. So she was able to kind of keep her name as just something other than a dragon lady. And now she has her own special Barbie doll and she has her face on a commemorative coin. So it really is nice to see that someone who once kind of lamented her face being used for such stereotypical depictions is now, kind of has the last laugh in the narrative. So Olivia de Havilland, I hope I said that correctly. I think a lot of people know who she is. When she passed away in 2020, that was seen as the final major death of the golden age of Hollywood. And she was also, I believe, the final surviving cast member of Gone with the Wind. She lived to 104 years old. Um, so she was one of the biggest stars of the golden age, had a contract. So back then, contracts with studios were, Todd, do you think saying borderline oppressive is an accurate way to put that?
I would say so, with potential examples we could do away with the borderline part.
I'm trying to be charitable here, but yes, contracts are not what they are now. The way contracts are now is they still exist. There is a little bit more wiggle room. I think most contracts even say, look, if you want to go do a smaller project, you're allowed to. You just have to fulfill a certain amount of pictures for us. Versus back then, you're tied to this studio for years. You can't, like, let's say, I'm thinking of a star right now. I'll do Julianne Moore. Let's say Julianne Moore was locked into a 5-year contract with Universal. but she goes, "Oh, this A24 is doing this really small movie and it sounds amazing. And my agent sent me the script. If she tried to go do that, they could terminate her contract, they could sue her for breach of contract, or they could just say, no, you're not doing that. Doesn't exist now. They decided it's better to give their employees a little bit more wiggle room. Or they now do it's like you have a multi-picture deal where it's like you have three pictures, but you can fulfill the pictures in a little bit more elasticity with the time frame. So Olivia was in a 7-year contract with Warner Brothers in 1936, and she refused to appear in some films that were assigned to her. This is another thing where, in many cases, Hollywood, yeah, in some ways has changed, some ways has not. I mean, there are still people who will say, I took this because it was a job, especially when they're just starting out. They're like, oh, I did not want to be in that movie, but I wanted to work. But they would tell you, you have to be in these movies. Although, Todd, do we think that would apply to Dakota Johnson and Madam Web, or do we think that's a little different?
It's not as all encompassing, but there was definitely, I mean, that's still those things that comes up with the different sense of there's the movie you sign up for, there's a movie gets made, you can't really, you realize afterwards, the ink's dry, I can't back out at this
Yeah,
point.
so if you are not familiar with this, there was an incredibly bad superhero movie that came out recently called Madam Web, and Dakota Johnson, the star, has been on a scorched earth press tour, pretty much saying she did not like the film, but you know, she's gotten questions of, well, then why did you do it? And her reasoning was, well, I signed up for this and then everything changed. And yes, that can still happen. So
And unlike directors, actors can't really Alan Smithy their way out of that.
yeah, you've got to be in it. And we know it's you, Dakota. We see you right there. So think of that idea of you signed your name to this project, you signed the contract, you can't get out of it now, even though it's been changed. Imagine that like times 10 back in the 1930s. So Olivia said, looks at some of these films and she goes, these are beneath me. I don't want to be in them. So she got suspended from the studio for 6 months. Her contract's finally up in 1943, and she's like, okay, good. I can finally go do some other movies, maybe work with a better studio. And then Warner Brothers just says, no, we're adding 6 months on for the months that you were suspended and not working. So rather than just go, okay, that's it, I'm going to tough this out for 6 more months, she says, heck to the no, I'm fighting this in court. And she ends up winning. And this is a fairly well-known labor law in California. And it says, no specific performance beyond a 7-year contract. They're like, that's it, whether she was suspended or not, whether she worked or not, you're done. And it is called the de Havilland Law. So imagine fighting the system and actually getting a law named after your victory. So now we are looking at another silent actress. This is Lillian Gish. So as I mentioned before, Mary Pickford didn't quite make the transition to talkies. Lillian Gish did. And like Pickford, she and her sister Dorothy were discovered by D.W. Griffin. And, she was also in Birth of a Nation, which on one hand, yes, an incredibly groundbreaking film, kind of the model for all modern well, the first blockbuster, the model for a lot of modern technology and film. Also, so racist that it was even called racist at the time movie. And there's actually been some controversy where there was a theater that was called the Lillian Gish Theater, and in what I personally would consider a wrong-headed decision, some people decided let's change it because of her association with that film. Personally, I don't think anyone should be reduced to one film unless you're Lenny Riefenstahl. I think that's a pretty awful bar. But I think, a lot of people look back at some movies they made and go, oof, wasn't proud of that. But moving on. She definitely had the ingenue quality on screen. I mean, Hollywood does like its young white ingenues. Um, and she loved working in the theater, and she actually went to work in the theater in New York in the 1930s when she kind of felt like the movie business was just not for her anymore. And she did direct a film in 1920. She directed her sister for the film Remodeling Her Husband. And there's some interesting interviews with her where she kind of goes like, "Oh, I just don't know if that's a woman's place. I think it's a woman's place to be directed and a man's place to direct." But there have been people who are like, well, potentially she's just saying that to avoid controversy because again, there were different values at that time. Even though prior to the 1920s, there were a lot of women who directed films. It was actually seen as a woman's business for a while, but kind of that way of her sort of keeping sweet with the film industry to kind of just say like, "Oh, little old me, I just did this for fun." And she left D.W. Griffin for MGM in 1922, again, specifically for more creative control, which kind of makes you think, yeah, I don't know how much of, that statement that she said was serious. And again, unlike Pickford, she made the transition to sound and she made films up until the 1980s. And she is in, if you've never seen this film, you should. Night of the Hunter, which I hope most people here have seen Night of the Hunter. It's amazing. She was also passionate about film preservation, and you can actually find this, I think, on the MoMA site. They have a bit of her will in there. She left a $1.2 million trust to the Museum of Modern Art specifically to preserve silent films, which is extremely important because a lot of early cinema, so much of it has already been lost due to just poor storage, and also old nitrate film is incredibly flammable, so it can get damaged, even if it's, poor storage is one thing. If it's stored to a point where it can catch fire, that's even worse. So someone who is able to navigate her career almost for, what would be like what, 80 years. So again, incredibly talented and smart woman. So I want to move on to this. We all know the dumb blonde trope, and there were two actresses, Jane Mansfield and Judy Holliday. I almost said James Mansfield because that is a drag queen who actually does the whole Jane Mansfield look. You can go look up afterwards. He actually does a pretty great job replicating it. But Jane Mansfield and Judy Holliday. But behind the kind of dumb blonde act were two women who were fairly smart and savvy. So Jane Mansfield, also both of these, you look at them like both fall into the gone too soon category. She was the almost one of the epitomes of the blonde bombshell. And, she had the curvy frame, the giggly voice, the giggly laugh, that high voice. In a great film called The Girl Can't Help It, which is probably, I'd say, like her best movie. She's so good in it. But she knew she was pretty. She knew she had a figure and a look that men would love, that women would envy, and that the industry would love. So she would actually call the paparazzi to come take pictures of her. She would dress more provocatively to get attention. She would stage photo shoots, including one with her then husband, Mickey Mantle, where he's like lifting her above her head. Oh, not Mickey Mantle, Mickey Hargitay. Sorry. Also, fun fact, if you did not know this, SVU actress Mariska Hargitay is Jane Mansfield's daughter. And behind the, her very curvaceous frame, Mansfield was, reportedly a very good student when she was younger. She was fluent in multiple languages. And when she wanted to start acting, she didn't get her start playing like the bimbo. She was working in stuff like Death of a Salesman in local theater. So she was someone who wanted to act, but as she was in the industry, saw her niche and said, I may as well just exploit this for as long as I can. And Judy Holliday, it's funny, I've been lamenting a lot how the Oscars don't take comedy seriously. Judy Holliday won an Oscar for a very comedic performance in the film Born Yesterday. I don't even know if a performance like that would be nominated nowadays. I feel like the Oscars, the Academy right now would look at that and go, oh, it's not serious enough, even though it is so hard to do comedy and do it right. But she was another woman, she was born in New York, very determined to be a star, but she was also very smart. She came from a family that was very passionate about social and political causes, and that ended up getting her in trouble during the Red Scare. So what she decided to do was go like, all right, I'm gonna play dumb. She basically played it like her character from Born Yesterday. And according to letters that were written afterwards, she wasn't entirely proud of having to do that. She's just like, I'm not this dumb in real life. I'm glad it worked. But she put it, she goes, hey, I didn't name names and I can say that much. And speaking of bombshells, Mae West, who really sad that at 38 she was considered too old to be hot. But again, we just talked about Kirsten Dunst being like, I'm just offered mom roles now. I mean, my gosh, Jennifer Lawrence is younger than me, and apparently she's getting mom role offers now. So I don't know what we can all do here. Um, Mae West got her start not just in theater, but in vaudeville and burlesque. So definitely a little bit more provocative than some of the theater that, like, Lillian Gish was or Lucille Ball was doing. So she was big on Broadway before she came to Hollywood. And she was a big star on Broadway. She wrote and produced her own shows. One was called Sex, and it was so provocative. She was arrested for obscenity in 1927 and actually spent, I believe, 8 nights in jail. But she refused to tone down her shows. She's like, absolutely not. This is what I want to make. Consequences be darned. And, I, as someone in a profession that's all about intellectual freedom, I always appreciate it when someone is willing to tell the Helen Lovejoys of the world, no thanks. So she decided to go to Hollywood, and considered too old to be a bombshell, but she still became a star because she just had it. And she was also really funny. This wasn't someone who needed to have a script fed to her. She would write her own stuff. She would crack her own jokes. She's actually really good at improvising. And even in the face of the Hays Code and the morality police, she's like, no, 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 you're not telling me what to do. And unfortunately, the Hays Code kind of pushed her back into theater for a bit, but she always found a way to work, even well into her final years. So while her final two movies, Myra Breckinridge and Sextet, I have seen Myra Breckinridge. It's not good. There is a bit of a camp value to it, though. Todd, actually, do you want to describe what Myra Breckinridge is about? Or are you not
Oh,
familiar with it?
I am familiar with it, but I'm trying to figure out. So, do we want to give away what's considered the famous twist of the movie?
You know what? We may as well.
Long story short, it turns out Myra Breckinridge was once a man.
Yeah, and she's played by Raquel Welch. Yeah. I mean, again, you can see why it has a little bit of a cult following, and I can see the camp appeal. But yeah, not well received. But even those two movies, they did not, sully her reputation as being a trailblazer in all sorts of ways. So, kind of unfortunately, getting into some sadder examples here, although I should note both Jane Mansfield and Judy Holliday are also tragic examples. Mansfield died in a car accident in her 30s, and Judy Holliday passed away from breast cancer in her 40s. And, two performers that I think definitely had a lot more to give. But I think if we talk about brains behind the beauty and the tragedy of that, I think there's probably no better example than Marilyn Monroe, whose career is really almost all about has been overshadowed by the tragedy, and to the point where almost her whole life has been defined by her ending. Especially in that, I think, incredibly poor taste film Blonde last year, but I'll get to that in a minute. And to be fair, Marilyn Monroe's life was not, she did not have an easy beginning. You could say she had a tragic upbringing. Her mother was a single-ish parent. I don't think she ever knew who her dad was, or I think she met him one time. She did end up finding out she had half siblings at one point, but wasn't really that close to them. She was in and out of foster homes. Her mother ended up being institutionalized after a breakdown, and she suffered abuse at the hands of one of her guardians. And again, this was at a time where if you were abused, especially if, you didn't talk about it. And, there was this idea of, oh, well, that only happens to like fast girls, or, oh, you don't want to say that, then no man will ever want to marry you. He'll consider you like damaged goods. So you have to imagine she suffered through a lot of this in silence. But she had, again, a drive to want to be famous. She did marry fairly early, and that marriage ended. A lot of younger actresses, I think they got married. I get the impression, I should say, that they got married at a young age as a way to get out. And the minute they could, they're like, all right, bye. I'm out of here. Because again, the way there were not as many ways out back then. So she had her start actually with more serious roles as her career started out, but became very apparent early on. She wasn't a supporting player. She had star power, she had charisma, and she had sex appeal. And we're kind of getting, the 50s, we were starting to see sex appeal become more of a thing and, more acceptable, which, I mean, hey, we could say Mae West helped that out. So she gets cast in these like blonde bombshell roles, kind of the dumb blonde role, but people have described her as like she was the dumb blonde who was in on the joke. Or if you even watch her in stuff like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes or Some Like It Hot, you know, she plays her character as kind of like spacey, and especially Some Like It Hot, kind of spacey, kind of airheady, but she also is not dumb. Like, she says, she's like, oh, I'm sick of getting involved with these no good men. I am specifically going to find someone else. She has a brain on her head. And you always get the sense that her characters, or the way she plays them, that her characters are also aware of the way they look. And again, this idea of like, I'm going to use this to my advantage if I need to. But again, behind, the face of one of the most beautiful women on the planet was an incredibly smart person, despite having no, like, next to no real former schooling. She loved to read. She was an incredibly curious person. She had a library full of books. Again, James Joyce, Walt Whitman, Saul Bellow, like, not, this wasn't a dumb lady who was like reading the funny pages. Not that there's anything wrong with reading the funny pages, but she was someone who had a thirst to learn, a thirst to read. Like her husband with art was Arthur Miller. And she actually she was like, oh, I loved hanging out with his friends because they actually challenged me. Versus sometimes when she was in Hollywood, she's like, I feel all people care about is how I looked. And as I say, since her death, she's almost been just eclipsed by the idea of she died young, she died tragedy. There are conspiracies surrounding her death, but she also had a long history of substance abuse and very likely tied to some of the trauma she suffered as a child. So it's, I think, just as likely, if not more so, that it was just an accidental overdose. But a lot of the people who knew her have tried to kind of take that image back and go, it wasn't just tragedy. This was a smart person who did have a zest for life. And when that film Blonde came out, no, it wasn't last year, it was 2022. The people who knew Marilyn, again, they're getting older, but they came out and were really taken aback by that film. And they just said, it's like, it's turning this woman who was a very multifaceted person into just a tragedy is offensive. And they said the film didn't talk about, the other interests she had, how she loved to go to like parlor parties and talk to intellectuals. It just made her into someone who was victimized by every person she came in contact with. And yes, I don't think there's any doubt that Marilyn Monroe, much like many other actresses, were victims of that system. But to reduce anyone to just victimhood is dehumanizing in its own way and takes away the agency that they had. All right. And kind of going off of that, towards the end of her career, Marilyn Monroe got the reputation of being difficult and hard to work with. Billy Wilder was fairly candid that she was not easy on the set of Some Like It Hot. But the reason is she had drug addiction and other substance abuse issues. And again, we think, well, knowing what we know now, some of what her early life was like, and therapy was not as accepted as it was back then as it is now. Was this a way for her to deal with the pain? And unfortunately, we'll likely never completely know that. Um, but this idea of the word difficult being thrown onto these women, and if we look at today's context, difficult was a word that was weaponized by people like Harvey Weinstein, women who either, you know, eschewed his advances or called him out publicly. He would start to spread the word of they're difficult, they're hard to work with, and essentially blackballing actresses like Annabella Sciorra and Mira Sorvino. But difficult has been around for women for a long time, and I have no doubt that that was also thrown around in the casting couch world. So again, women who kind of said, I'm not doing this, probably got the difficult label. But difficult was also used to describe women or people, actors and actresses, but women in particular, who were dealing with mental health problems, which were went many cases undiagnosed until much later. So we're going to look at Vivian Leigh, who known for two of the most iconic movies ever made, Gone with the Wind and Streetcar Named Desire, which she won Best Actress for both. And she was someone who, especially as the years went on, had the reputation of being difficult. But turns out she had bipolar disorder. And she, again, probably wasn't getting the medication for it. She probably wasn't getting therapy for it. I mean, I think that what was there, electroshock therapy? And then she also had health struggles because she had chronic tuberculosis. So she was written off in the industry as difficult to work with, but underneath that was stuff she couldn't control. And similar was for Gene Tierney, for great movies like Laura and Ghost and Mrs. Muir. If you've never seen the Ghost and Mrs. Muir, it's actually one of my favorite, more romantic movies. She had manic depression and she did seek treatment again. Electroshock therapy was what was available. I don't know if that's used now. I hope not. But her struggles were so bad, she eventually tried to take her own life in 1957. She stepped on a ledge and people had to talk her down. And she had to go away for a while. And unlike Vivian Leigh, she was actually able to have a career resurgence later, probably because it was just a few years later and there was starting to be a little bit more awareness about these diseases. So people saw it as like, oh, this isn't entirely her fault. There's other things at play here. Versus you look at someone like Vivian Leigh, did not exactly get the same amount of sympathy. And then you have to think about how many other performers were written off as difficult when there was really something much more under the surface. So we move on to Sharon Tate, another person really eclipsed by the tragedy that ended her life, but someone who is also kind of known for something very one note, which is her beauty. And I mean, we can see why. She was gorgeous. But she was also someone who was, you could probably argue, wise beyond her years. If you've ever watched, and she's one of the few actresses where like there is thankfully a lot of footage of her. If you ever watch her speak, she's more eloquent than me, incredibly eloquent, incredibly thoughtful in how she chooses her words, and very well spoken, probably because she did pageants, so she knows how to have that public presentation. But she was someone who actually grew up very shy and very not confident in who she was and how she looked. She was a military brat and moved around frequently. I'm actually a military brat myself, and while I didn't move around as much, I definitely do understand there is almost a sense of detachment you have with people. You're very apprehensive to make friends. I remember growing up at the end of a school year asking classmates, "Oh, so are you going to be here next year?" Because there's always the chance that they could move away. But she did pageants, which did develop her confidence and developed her public speaking. So again, you go watch interviews with her. She's very poised in interviews. And again, like a lot of these actresses, they knew what they wanted to be at a young age, and they're like, I'm going to figure out a way to to get what I want. So when she was in Italy, there was a production, the film Hemingway's Adventures of, well, as the young man, I knew I had one typo that I probably didn't find. She went to where they were filming and like, oh, I'm just going to be an extra. And of course, a casting agent sees her and is like, you're one of the most beautiful people I've ever laid eyes on. So she gets, a contract fairly quickly. And I'm not going to go over the gory details. We all know the story. Right as she's really on her ascendancy, she is, along with friends, in the wrong house at the wrong time when members of the Manson family attack. And that took her life. And yeah, not going to go into the gruesome details on that. But she was someone who, as her career was ramping up, like the Valley of the Dolls is really the big hit for her. People were going like, oh, you're so beautiful. Oh, you're getting comparison to Marilyn Monroe. And she was like, do not compare me to her, not as a derogatory term, but a like, there's only one Marilyn Monroe. I could never be her. I'm just trying to be myself. But she also talked about how seriously she took the craft of acting, and she kind of did not want to be known for her looks. So she talked about like taking classes and doing scene work, and really she saw this as a job and as a craft that she had to perfect rather than something that was going to be handed to her based on her looks. And she actually, as her career was taking off, she took more comedic roles. So she is in it's called a comedy. It's not really a great comedy, but she is in Fearless Vampire Killers, where she met her future husband, Roman Polanski, and she's in the film The Wrecking Crew. And The Wrecking Crew is a very comedic performance for her. And she kind of plays like the klutzy, I don't know if buffoon would be the right word, and ditz isn't the right word because her character's actually pretty smart. It's just she's the clumsy yet capable helper. And she's very funny in it. And she actually kind of felt like that's more what I want to do. And I think had she been able to continue her career, she likely would have gone, I think, the Goldie Hawn route, who started out as a bombshell, but then realizing I'm very comedic gifted in a comedic sense. And like Goldie Hawn eventually was another one who started to become a producer, started to become very selective with her roles. And she probably could have gone that route. And if again, there are a lot of people alive who knew her, and they said they're like, she was probably the least. You look at her and you would think she's probably a little elitist, a little snobby, and they're like, no, she was the nicest person ever. If anything, she was kind of a goofy person. She liked to walk barefoot everywhere. Um, and her sister wrote a book a few years ago, was Sharon Tate retrospective, and she actually shared the final memory she had with her sister. And it wasn't going out to parties, it wasn't, doing a makeover. It was just her and her family sitting and watching the moon landing and how excited she was because she's like, oh, how cool is this? So this also person was very down to earth. And another thing I would like to point out is if you've ever seen the Polanski film Tess, which for reasons we all know has a little bit of baggage to it. You can go read when that movie was made, but there is a dedication at the start of that film that just says to Sharon. And before she was murdered, she was reading the book Tess Duberville's. She was also another person who very literary minded, liked to read, and she had actually given that book to Roman Polanski and said, I think this would be a wonderful movie to make. We should do this someday. So when he made it, he dedicated it to her. And what I would consider to be Roman Polanski's last, well, pianist is good, but again, baggage. But one of Polanski's really great films would not have happened if it weren't for Sharon Tate. So, as a postscript, I've been kind of talking about the actresses today versus actresses of yesteryear and kind of how it's changing slowly. There have been some changes for the better. So we now have these actresses who are a lot more assertive and a lot more willing to take their careers into their own hands publicly, not just behind the scenes. Again, we have a more, a funnier example of Dakota Johnson just going like, this was not the movie I signed up for. But my gosh, if you did that, I think even 30 years ago that could have killed your career versus now it's kind of made people like her. They're like, hey, I didn't really think much of you before, but good on you. I've had jobs I hated too. I can relate to you on that. Or you have a lot of actresses going the producer route, like Emma Stone, who won Best Actress last night. She was a producer on Poor Things. You have actresses going, well, I'm going to try to direct, or I'm going to at least write a script and see what I can do with that. Or you have the example of Margot Robbie, who is probably, I would say, the best example of having beauty behind the brains. So Margot Robbie makes a splash in the film The Wolf of Wall Street, where she plays Leonardo DiCaprio's second wife, who is a very attractive, very curvy trophy wife. Or between that and then that Suicide Squad movie, the words "the next Megan" or the phrase "the next Megan Fox" kept coming up, and Megan Fox was someone who was not treated great by the industry. She was put out there as a young hot thing, and the minute she got a little older and was not attached to big hit movies anymore, Hollywood kind of pushed her aside. And my personal theory is Margot Robbie saw that that was going around and she called her agent and said, "Get me I, Tanya." So which, very unglamorous role. And if you've never seen I, Tanya, it's great. And if you ever doubt that Margot Robbie can actually act, again, watch that movie. Um, but instead of just saying, okay, I guess I'll just keep doing these pretty parts until something good comes along, Margot Robbie took the step to be like, no, 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 get me something that shows what I can do. Charlize Theron is also, I think, a good example of that. She was definitely known as like the beautiful girl for a while, and then she, said, put me in ugly makeup and make me play a serial killer. And while it is a choice that some people kind of mock the playing ugly to be taken seriously, in some cases, that's what you have to do to be taken seriously in this industry, and you have to work within it sometimes. But most recently, Margot Robbie believed in Greta Gerwig's Barbie so much, she signed on as an executive producer. She vouched for the film herself. That movie made over $1 billion, and that, in addition to her salary making that film, she earned an extra 50 million. So talk about being paid what you're worth. And with that, I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions. Again, I clearly couldn't cover everybody. There's actresses like Betty Davis, Joan Crawford, Katharine Hepburn, but those were women who I think are all very well known as being very assertive women who did what they had to do to keep relevant in the industry. All right, seeing other people say they love Born Yesterday. That is a Turner Classic Movie showed it a while back. So, um, as someone else put it, they said she helped pilot ensuring I Love Lucy was taped and got residuals, which yes, relates to another program I had done recently, the that kind of relates to the Hollywood strikes. And it's like hey, what's a reoccurring theme with Hollywood strikes? We'd like residuals, please. Yeah, great program. And again, I know there were a lot of other actresses, a couple of people I'd considered. Jean Wyman was another one I'd thought about. She was another actress where once it looked like Hollywood wasn't or the films weren't coming to her, she decided to pivot to television. And I think Rita Moreno was the other one, but Rita Moreno, I think, eventually just fell into the camp of, I think she is still around and she is outspoken enough about what she had to do and the pivots she had to make to survive, where I'm like, I kind of wanted to highlight some other people. But I figured this would be a good Women's History Month program, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. And again, actually, for the first, speaking of the Oscars, for the first time last night, 3 of the 10 films nominated were directed by women. That is a milestone. I mean, hey, we're getting there little by little. But yes, Barbie, Anatomy of a Fall, and Past Lives were all directed by women. And Poor Things was produced by its star Emma Stone. So again, things are changing for the better. And I just want to give a quick rundown of some movies, not movies, our programs coming up. So next month, I am going to be talking about physical media, past, present, and future, and its importance now. as it looks like studios are trying to do away with mass released physical media. And in May, we are going to talk about the life of Gene Siskel. I'm in a sort of a companion piece to my Life of Roger Ebert program last year. And in May, since it's Pride Month, I am going to be talking about one of my favorite filmmakers and probably one of the most well-known gay filmmakers out there, which is Pedro Almodovar. So be sure to be very bright and colorful for that program, because if there's one thing Almodovar loves, it's well-dressed women in good color. Well, two things. Okay. Look, I didn't major in math, everybody. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I would just like to thank everyone for coming tonight. And actually, hopefully, I will see some of you at Wednesday's virtual program for Jenny Powers, The Woman Who Dares, continuing the Women's History Month theme. So, have a good night.